morning my son became a doctor, I was sitting in the third row of the Northwestern Memorial Hospital auditorium, holding a small velvet box in my coat pocket. Inside was my late wife's wedding ring. I'd carried it for 16 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to my son, so he could one day pass it to whoever made him as happy as Margaret had made me. I never gave it to him. My name is Clayton. I'm 63 years old. I worked 38 years as a long-haul mechanic for a freight company outside Toledo, Ohio. My hands look like road maps. My back hasn't been right since 2009. And a boy I raised alone from the time he was 7 years old stood at that podium last June in front of 240 new physicians and their families and thanked a man who had never changed a diaper, never sat through a fever, never held him while he cried about his mother. He thanked Dr. Whitaker. He thanked his second father. He never said my name. Not once. I'm going to tell you the whole story, and I'm going to tell it the way it happened, because I've had almost a year to sit with it, and I've stopped trying to dress it up. There's no pretty way to describe what it feels like to disappear in front of your own child, but there's also no pretty way to describe what happened after, when the man who replaced me in my son's heart turned out to be exactly the kind of man I'd spent 40 years working honestly to never become. Let me back up. Margaret died in the spring of 2008. My son Tobias was 7. She had a stroke at the kitchen sink while she was rinsing strawberries for his lunch. I came home that afternoon and found him sitting on the linoleum next to her, still holding her hand, telling her about a book they'd read at school. He thought she was sleeping. He was singing to her so she wouldn't wake up scared. I want you to understand something before I go any further. That boy was the best thing that ever happened to me. I held him through every bad night for the next 10 years. I learned how to braid hair for the school play. I learned how to bake a birthday cake from a Betty Crocker box because Margaret used to do it from scratch, and I couldn't manage scratch. I cut my own hours to be home for dinner. I took an evening shift at a transmission shop 2 miles from our house, so I could help with homework before driving over. I never missed a parent-teacher night. Not one. Not even the year I had pneumonia and showed up in a sweatshirt because I couldn't button a real shirt. I had a savings account I opened the week he was born. I put $200 in it that first month when the hospital bills were still on the kitchen table. After Margaret passed and I started picking up extra work, I bumped it up to $700. Every 2 weeks the deposit went through automatically. I never touched it. Not when the furnace died in 2013, not when my truck threw a rod in 2017, and I drove a loaner from a coworker for 4 months. Not when the property taxes jumped and I had to take out a small line of credit to keep the house. 18 years of $700 every 2 weeks, plus what compounded with a decent index fund my friend at the credit union helped me set up. By the time Tobias finished medical school, that account had grown to just over $412,000. I never told him about it. I wanted it to be a surprise for the day he opened his own practice, or bought his first house, or got married. I figured I'd hand it over and tell him it was from his mother and me both, because she would have done the same if she lived. Now I have to tell you about Patrice. Patrice came into our lives when Tobias was 12. She was a substitute teacher at his middle school, and we met at a grief support meeting at the Lutheran church. She'd lost a husband. She had no kids. She was warm, she laughed easily, and she made meatloaf better than anyone I'd ever met. We dated for 2 years. I married her in 2015. Tobias liked her well enough. He called her Patrice. He never called her Mom, and she never asked him to, and I appreciated that. The marriage lasted 3 years. It didn't end ugly. It ended quiet, which I've come to learn is sometimes worse. She told me on a Tuesday in October of 2018 that she felt like she was raising another woman's son and living in another woman's house, and she needed something of her own. She moved to Cincinnati to be closer to her sister. We split everything down the middle. She sent Tobias a card on his 16th birthday and another one when he graduated high school. After that, nothing. Tobias was 16 when she left. He was old enough to understand. He wasn't crushed. He was sad for me more than for himself, which I think tells you something about the kind of kid he was. 3 years went by. Tobias got into the University of Michigan on a partial scholarship. I covered the rest from my paycheck and took out a small loan in my name so he wouldn't graduate with debt. He hit the dean's list every semester. He got into Northwestern's medical school in 2022. I drove him out to Chicago in a U-Haul I rented for $68 and helped him carry his boxes up to a third-floor walk-up on the north side. We ate deep dish pizza on the floor of his empty apartment, and he fell asleep with his head on a moving blanket. I covered him with my jacket and slept in the truck so I could get an early start home. Then Patrice came back. This is the part I still don't fully understand. I'll tell you what I know. In the fall of his second year of medical school, Tobias called me on a Sunday and said Patrice had reached out. She'd seen him on the dean's list in some Michigan alumni newsletter. She'd been in touch on Facebook. She wanted to take him to dinner the next time she was in Chicago. He asked me if that was all right with him, like he needed permission. I said, "Of course, son, she was good to you. You should see her." I meant it. What I didn't know is that Patrice had remarried. A man named Dr. Wallace Whitaker, a cardiothoracic surgeon at a private hospital network out of Lake Forest. Big house, bigger reputation. The kind of man who had a Tesla in the driveway and a foundation with his name on it. Whitaker started taking Tobias to dinners at restaurants where the entrees cost more than I made in a day. He paid for a tuition supplement that summer. He flew Tobias to a cardiology conference in Boston business class. He introduced him to attending physicians at Northwestern, hospital board members, residency directors. He told Tobias that with the right mentorship, the right doors opened, the boy could match into a top cardiothoracic program and skip the line that took most people 15 years to even get near. I knew some of this. I didn't know all of it. Tobias would mention Whitaker on the phone the way you mention a teacher you respect. Dr. Whitaker had me observe a valve replacement last weekend. Dr. Whitaker is putting me in touch with the program director at Cleveland Clinic. I was proud of him. I told him so. I figured the man was being generous because he didn't have his own children and he saw something in my son. What I didn't see, because I wasn't looking, was that Patrice and Whitaker had been slowly moving themselves into the center of his life while I was still in the wings. I drove to Chicago for the white coat ceremony in his first year. Tobias hugged me, introduced me to two of his classmates, and we got dinner at the chain restaurant near his apartment. He paid. I let him. I drove out for his MD/MBA graduation last June. He had finished medical school in a one-year business administration program through Kellogg. He was 26 years old. He had been named class speaker. I was so proud I cried in the truck on the way down. I'd been crying off and on for a week, honestly. I packed Margaret's ring in my coat pocket and a small framed picture of the three of us from when Tobias was 5, sitting on a beach in Sandusky. The auditorium was nice. Big stained glass behind the stage. 240 graduates in white coats, their families filling the rows. I sat where Tobias had told me to sit, third row on the aisle. Patrice and Whitaker were in the front row. Whitaker was in a tailored navy suit. Patrice was in a cream-colored dress and a string of pearls I had never seen. Tobias walked to the podium when his name was called. He looked tall. He looked like his mother. He thanked the dean. He thanked his classmates. He thanked his professors. He told a funny story about his anatomy partner. He thanked his mother Patrice, who came back into my life at exactly the moment I needed her, who reminded me what family means. I sat very still, he said, and to Dr. Wallace Whitaker, who didn't have to do any of this, who saw a kid from a small town in Ohio and decided to invest in him, who showed me what it means to have a father who truly believes in your future. I want you to know I see what you did for me. I wouldn't be standing here without you. You shaped the doctor I'm going to be. You are the reason I'm here. He didn't say my name. I waited. He talked about his future. He talked about his residency match, which he hadn't even officially announced yet at Cleveland Clinic in cardiothoracic surgery, a position that I would later learn Whitaker had personally lobbied for over the course of 2 years. He didn't say my name. He was almost done. He was wrapping up. He said, and to my family and the audience, thank you for everything you've done. That was it. That was my line. Everything you've done. I sat there for another 20 seconds while he took a breath and started his closing. And then I stood up. I didn't make a scene. I didn't slam the chair. I just stood up and walked down the aisle, past the woman in the green dress who had to pull her purse in to let me by, and I walked out of the auditorium while my son was still talking. I heard a few people murmur behind me. I didn't look back. I went out to the parking garage and I sat in my truck. I took the velvet box out of my coat pocket and I held it in my lap for a long time. I didn't cry. I think I was too tired to cry. I had been carrying that ring for 16 years. I drove back to Toledo that night. 6.5 hours. I stopped once for gas in Indiana. I got home around 4 in the morning, and I sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up. He called me 3 times the next day. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail that said, "Dad, I don't know where you went. Are you okay?" That was the message. He didn't know where I went. I wrote him a letter. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'll tell you the gist. I told him I had been sitting in the 3rd row. I told him I had driven 6 hours to be there. I told him I had driven 6 hours to be there. I told him I had heard every word of his speech. I told him that I understood Patrice and Whitaker had been good to him, and that I was glad for it. But that I had been the one who held his hand when his mother died, and that I had been the one who showed up. I told him I needed some time. I told him not to call me for a while. I mailed it the next morning. He called twice more that week. He texted. He emailed. I didn't respond. Now I have to tell you the part where the world started to balance itself out. And I want to be clear about something. I didn't do any of this. I want you to understand that. I didn't pick up a phone. I didn't write a letter. I didn't call a single person. What happened to Whitaker? Happened to Whitaker because Whitaker had been Whitaker for a long time. And I just happened to be the one still standing when the rest of it came down. 2 weeks after the graduation, I got a phone call from a woman I'd never spoken to before. Her name was Linda. She was an old friend of Margaret's from college. We had exchanged Christmas cards every year since 1998 and not much else. She had seen Tobias's graduation announcement in some alumni newsletter, and she had recognized Wallace Whitaker's name in the photo caption. She told me that Whitaker had been her sister's husband in the late 90s. He had cleaned out the joint accounts and disappeared after their daughter was diagnosed with a kidney condition. He had resurfaced years later under a different middle name, with a doctor in front of his name that Linda's family was pretty sure was a doctorate from a school that had since lost its accreditation. She said it carefully. She said she didn't want to make trouble. She just thought I should know. I didn't do anything with that information. I want you to understand that too. I didn't call a journalist. I didn't call a state board. I wrote it down in a notebook and put the notebook in a drawer. 6 weeks later, the Chicago Tribune ran a story about a federal investigation into a hospital network in Lake Forest, Illinois, regarding upcoded billing on cardiac procedures. Whitaker's name was in the 3rd paragraph. He was named as a person of interest, not yet charged. The story was small, below the fold. By August, the network had suspended his privileges pending review. By September, the state medical board had opened a formal inquiry into the legitimacy of his original credentialing after an anonymous tip. By October, he had been fired. By November, his foundation had quietly closed. By December, his wife had filed for divorce. His wife, Patrice. I learned all of this from Linda and from the Tribune. I read the articles in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I want to be honest about something else. When I started reading those articles, I thought about Tobias. I thought about how he was tied to Whitaker now, in a real way. The recommendation letters, the conference appearances, the introductions at Cleveland Clinic, the mentor Tobias had named in his graduation speech in front of 200 families and an alumni magazine that was still online. I picked up the phone twice to call him. I put it down both times. He called me on Christmas Eve. I let it go to voicemail. He called again on Christmas Day. I let that go too. His message said, "Dad, please. Please call me. Something has happened. I really need to talk to you." I called him back the next morning. He cried on the phone for almost 10 minutes before he could form a sentence. I let him. I made coffee with my free hand. When he could finally speak, he said, "Dad, my residency offer was rescinded. They said the recommendation was tainted. Whitaker's being investigated for fraud, Dad. He's not even a real doctor. He's not even a real doctor. He's not, Dad, I don't know what's real." I let him talk. I let him say what he needed to say. He told me Patrice had moved out of the house in Lake Forest and was staying in a hotel. He told me the loans Whitaker had co-signed for him, supplemental loans on top of his federal ones, were now being called in because Whitaker's credit had collapsed. He told me he owed almost $90,000 in private loans on top of his federal debt. He told me he had no residency, no job lined up, and he was terrified. He said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know." He said, He said, "I'm so sorry about the speech. I'm so sorry about the speech. I'm so sorry about the speech." I don't know why I did it. I think I wanted to believe that if I had a different kind of father, I'd be a different kind of person. I think I was ashamed of where I came from. I'm so ashamed of myself, Dad. I listened. I didn't say anything for a while. I said, "Tobias, I love you. I have loved you every single day of your life. There has not been one day, not one. I want you to know that." He cried again. I said, "We can figure out the loans. We'll figure it out together. But I need you to do something for me first." He said, "Anything." I said, "I need you to come home." He drove out the day after New Year's. He looked thinner. He sat at the kitchen table where I had sat the night I came home from the graduation, and he told me everything from the beginning, the dinners, the conference, the way Patrice had told him stories about my marriage that weren't true, the way Whitaker had told him that men who work with their hands didn't think about the future the way men with capital did, the way he had started, slowly, to believe that the life I had given him was something to be embarrassed about. He told me he had stopped telling his classmates I was a mechanic and started saying I worked in transportation. He told me he was so ashamed of himself for that, he could barely look at me. I let him tell me all of it. When he was done, I went to the hall closet and I took out a folder. Inside the folder was the statement from the savings account. I had printed it out the morning after I drove home from Chicago. $412,863. I slid it across the table. He looked at it. He looked at it. He didn't understand at first. He saw his name. He saw the date the account was opened. December 12th, 1996. 2 weeks after he was born. He looked at the deposit history. 18 years of $700 every 2 weeks. He looked at the balance. He started shaking. I said this was going to be for whenever you needed it. I always thought it'd be a wedding. Or a house. I figured your mother would have wanted it that way. He couldn't speak. I said, "I'm not giving it all to you. I want you to listen to me carefully. I'm going to pay off the $90,000 in private loans. You're not carrying Whitaker's signature anymore. That's done. The rest of it I'm going to split." He nodded. He was waiting. I said, "I'm going to put $100,000 into a fund in your mother's name at the Toledo Public Hospital where she died, for families who can't afford the bills the day they walk in. I want her name on something that helps people. She would have liked that." He nodded again. Tears were running down his face, but he was trying to hold himself together. I said, "And the rest, about $220,000, I'm putting in a trust for you, but not for now. You're going to redo this. You're going to apply to residencies on your own merit. No Whitaker, no shortcuts. You're going to live small for a few years. You're going to remember who you are. And when you're settled, somewhere down the road, that money will be there. Not as a handout, as a foundation. The way your mother and I always meant it." He put his head in his hands and he cried. Not the polite kind of crying. The kind I hadn't seen since he was 7 years old, and I came home from the hospital and told him his mother wasn't coming back. He said, Dad, I don't deserve any of this." I said, "Probably not. Not today. But you're my son, and one day you will." He stayed 3 days. We didn't talk about Whitaker much after that. We talked about Margaret. I showed him the box of letters she'd written me when I was on long hauls in the early years of our marriage. He'd never read them. He sat on the living room floor and read them all in one night. Before he left, he asked me about the velvet box. He'd seen it on the dresser in the spare room. I told him what it was. I told him I'd been going to give it to him at the graduation. He asked if I would still give it to him. I said, not yet, but not never. He nodded. He understood. He matched into a residency this past March. Internal medicine, not cardiothoracic. A community hospital in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The starting salary is $62,000 a year. He's going to be a few years behind where he might have been with Whitaker's help. He doesn't seem to mind. He calls me every Sunday, sometimes twice. Patrice tried to reach him in February. She left a voicemail asking if he could lend her some money to help with her legal fees. He didn't call her back. I didn't ask him not to. He just didn't call her back. Whitaker was indicted in April. I won't follow the trial. I don't need to. The fund in Margaret's name opened in February. The hospital sent me a photograph of the small plaque they put up in the family services hallway. Her name, her years. A line that says, "For the families who walk in afraid." I cried when I saw it. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I'm 63 years old. My hands still look like road maps. My back still isn't right. I still drive the truck I bought in 2017. I still work 2 days a week at the transmission shop because I like the people there, and I'm not ready to be retired. But I'll tell you something I've learned, and I'll tell you because I think there are men out there who need to hear it. Maybe a few women too. You can do the work. You can show up every day for 18 years. You can pack the lunches and braid the hair and sit in the parent-teacher meetings in the same sweatshirt. And there is no guarantee that the child you raise is going to see what you did. There's no guarantee they're going to thank you. There's no guarantee they won't. One day, in a moment that's supposed to be the proudest day of your life, look right past you and thank somebody who paid for a dinner. That hurts. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't, but there's also no guarantee on the other side that the man who replaces you is going to last. Time has a way of finding out what's real. The work I did for my son was real. The savings account was real. The lunches, and the braids, and the loaner truck, and the pneumonia, and the parent-teacher nights were real. And when the world finally tilted the way the world tilts, when the shiny thing turned out to be hollow, it was the real thing my son came back to. He came back to me. Not because I made him, not because I shamed him, not because I called him 40 times. He came back because the work I did was the only thing in his life that was still standing. That's what I want to leave you with. If you're a parent and you've been doing the work and nobody seems to see it, I want you to keep doing it anyway. Not because you're guaranteed a thank you. You're not. But because one day the wind is going to change, and when it does, the only thing that'll be left standing in your child's life is whatever was real. Make sure what you built was real. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourselves out there, and call your father if you still can. I've thought about this every morning since Tobias drove back to Grand Rapids. I sit at the same kitchen table where Margaret used to drink her coffee, and I turn it over in my head, and I keep arriving at the same place. Nothing that happened to Wallace Whitaker happened because of me. I want that to be clear. I never made a phone call. I never wrote a letter. I never pulled a single thread. The man built a life out of borrowed credentials and other people's money, and the weight of what he built finally caught up with him. That's not revenge. That's just what time does to things that aren't real. And I think that's the lesson I want to leave with whoever's still sitting with me on this. The world has a way of sorting itself out, but it takes longer than we want it to. While you're waiting, you have to keep your hands on what's actually yours, the work, the character, the promises you keep when nobody's watching. I made a choice when Margaret died. I chose to show up, not the showy kind of showing up. The boring kind. The pneumonia in a sweatshirt kind. $700 every 2 weeks for 18 years. Lunches and braids and parent-teacher nights. None of it photographed well. None of it would have made a good speech. But it was real, and real has a way of outlasting the alternative. What Tobias did at that podium hurt me more than I knew anything could hurt at 62 years old. But I want to be honest, the hurt wasn't really about the speech. The hurt was about the 18 years he was choosing to forget. And I had a decision to make in that moment about whether I was going to chase him through the rest of his life trying to be remembered, or whether I was going to step back and let him learn what real and unreal feel like when the unreal one finally collapses. I stepped back. That took more strength than anything I've done in my life, including the night I came home and found Margaret on the kitchen floor. Standing up and walking out of that auditorium without yelling, without making a scene, without writing a long, angry message at 3 a.m, just walking out and going home and waiting. That's the part I want anyone listening to take with them. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is the discipline to not call back. Sometimes wisdom is the patience to let a lie complete itself. Sometimes character is doing the right thing for so long, so quietly, that when the lights finally come on, you're the only one still standing in the room. Tobias came back because the work I'd done was the only thing in his life that hadn't fallen apart. I didn't earn that with a speech. I earned it with 18 years of small Tuesdays. That's the math. The small Tuesdays add up. They always do.